Hi everyone, in today's video module we'll be talking about biotic interactions, in particular how plants interact with herbivores and pathogens. And plants have developed various defense strategies against these groups of organisms, and so we'll start with the first type of defense mechanisms plants have used for this type of interaction. Here is a very general diagram showing the variety of interactions plants can have with different organisms. Some of these interactions are beneficial, even mutually beneficial, like we've talked about in previous modules with respect to legumes and rhizobia and their symbiotic relationship in forming root nodules. We also talked about the mycorrhizal associations in different root systems. We haven't talked about plant pollinator interactions, but this is a particular interaction that's usually grouped in this mutually beneficial interaction. Then there are the obvious negative interactions that we can have. So these can be, take various different forms such as herbivory, pathogens, parasites, and we talked about allelopathy a long time ago, in which some organisms can release a biochemical that is harmful to other organisms, such as plants in this case. But the distinction between beneficial and detrimental categories of interactions with other organisms is almost too general and too simplistic, meaning that you can have herbivory that may increase fitness, or non-pathogenic soil rhizobacteria and fungi, which actually cause no harm to the plant, but maybe they stimulate the plant's innate immune system and therefore add further protection down the line from other pathogenic microorganisms. There could also be interactions that are quite neutral, meaning it's not really harmful or beneficial, as well as when we look at some of these beneficial and detrimental interactions, this could be along a gradient. There could be cases where it's only slightly harmful or extremely harmful, and that might all depend on the environmental status. Plants have very specific defense mechanisms to deal with harmful interactions, which is what we'll start talking about in today's module. But the caveat to this is that some organisms have developed counter mechanisms to deal with these defensive strategies. So we end up in this scenario where plants and other organisms try to one-up each other, or they go back and forth in this evolutionary process known as coevolution. We will mostly focus on defense mechanisms for herbivores and pathogens, and this is a really interesting area of research because of the diversity and intensity of these interactions. As you can see in the slide here, that some herbivores are intense in how they consume plants, and others may seem a little bit more benign and kind of eat the plants at a slower rate, and other organisms might seem quite benign in that we can't really see them very well, some pathogens, but are actually quite damaging to the plant as well. So we'll look at a couple different mechanisms and how to deal with these herbivores and pathogens. And when we talk about plant strategies, there are really two categories that we are thinking about. First is constitutive defense, meaning that these mechanisms are already present in the plants, and so we'll focus on those today. There is also the second strategy of induced defenses, which basically means that these defense strategies are initiated only after damage has happened, either damage by an herbivore or an infection from a pathogen. But both of these strategies can help with dealing with some of these really intense chewing insects that we see over here that tend to do the most damage. We also have phloem feeders. They are also vectors for really bad viruses. And we can also have some pathogens that kind of leave these signs here of damage and infection. And we can also have others that are, piercing various cell content and cause damage that way. When we're talking about constitutive defense, then that really means we're thinking about like the first line of defense against any herbivore or pathogens for plants. And in this case, when we think about constitutive, again, it means that it's a mechanism that's already present, and these can simply refer to mechanical barriers. And we've talked about in the past when we're referencing the epidermis that we can have these specialized cells that are specialized extensions of the epidermis here, and these are great primarily for protection against herbivores. Another example would be having a thick cuticle, such as we might see on a cactus or prickly pear example here. So having that really thick waxy cuticle can prevent not only water loss, but can keep a lot of things out of the plant that might be harmful. And one of my favorite examples is when I used to live in the deserts of Arizona, and you can see this cholla plant here. This was often called jumping cholla, and it's because we see all these spines here were really easy to fall off. So even if you just slightly grazed it or brushed this cactus as you walked by, all of these would kind of easily fall off and basically land on you. And they also have these backwards facing barbs on each one of these spines. So when they get on you or in your skin, it really is difficult to get them out. It is really quite painful. So I've seen many friends out hiking or out doing field work that have embedded in their skin many of these spines from the cholla cactus. And here's a really short blog from In Defensive Plants talking about this cholla plant, and they're often referred to as jumping cholla or jumping cactus. And that's because you just simply walk by and you get what seems to be almost attacked by these chollas. They're really beautiful, but they have this really amazing mechanism to prevent any herbivory. And some plants are also really great, and they almost have two defenses at once. So here's a good example. Here's our classic trichome, again, an extension of the epidermal layer. And not only can the trichome be helpful in deterring herbivores or other organisms, well, just what is inside the trichome can actually be really helpful as well. So in this case, this trichome example, if we look at just the end of it here, well, it's actually made of material that's really easy to break. And so once it breaks, it's almost like glass. And once this top portion is broken off by something, then basically inside we have these compounds, this group of, it's almost like a cocktail of acids, and those get released to whatever animal or herbivore that has essentially tried to, cause damage to the plant. It is incredibly irritating. So if this is a classic example from stinging nettle. If you've ever encountered stinging nettle on a hike, or maybe you've helped your parents remove some from the backyard, you've likely come across this plant. And essentially it's really good at deterring anybody because it is so irritating. These acids that are inside the trichome are very irritating to the skin. So another really great example of a defensive mechanism. Again, this group applies to the constitutive defense mechanisms. I definitely want to take a moment to talk about that cocktail of acids we saw in the previous slide. So basically what those are essentially secondary metabolites. And so these are really great examples of constitutive defenses. It's important to make the distinction between primary metabolites and secondary metabolites. Primary metabolites essentially mean compounds that all plants produce. And, we've talked a great deal about photosynthesis. Of course, so sugars will be placed in the group of primary metabolites. A long list of others that are really important: amino acids, fatty acids, lipids, nucleotides, proteins, polysaccharides, DNA, RNA, all of these components that are really important and essential to survival for all plants. Of course, these are going to be grouped in the primary metabolites, and so these are really important for growth and development. And the secondary metabolites are not going to go directly towards growth or development. In fact, they're going to go towards other things like protection or helping with structure. And these are very specialized, so it's not going to be the same secondary metabolite that is present similarly between or across all plants. There's going to be very species specific in how these secondary metabolites are kind of presented within plants. And we have three main categories in this case of secondary metabolites: phenolics, terpenoids, alkaloids. Again, we don't have time to talk about the processing of how we get to these specific metabolites, but it is a little costly to invest in producing some of these, but they are really helpful in the end for defense against herbivores and pathogens. And they're not just helpful for only protection against pathogens or herbivores, they also play a very special role even as attractants for pollinators or other groups of organisms. Sometimes we need protection against other things that have nothing to do with biotic interactions. Sometimes it's protection against UV radiation. Sometimes it's going to help with dispersing fruit or allelopathy. Again, we talked about that a long time ago, but this is the group of these really specialized metabolites. They're going to be so helpful for protection or even other mechanisms like attracting pollinators. Now, a plant can do an amazing job of protecting itself from nearly all herbivores. But what is toxic to most herbivores could be highly useful to a specialized group. And here are some classic examples of that. So we have monarch butterfly, we have milkweed bugs, and milkweed aphids. And these are classic examples of organisms that have a very unique ability to not only withstand the toxic secondary metabolites that have been produced, but they can use them for their own benefit. So they're able to sequester these really toxic secondary metabolites in their own bodies, and that helps for their own protection against predators. And of course, these are really classic examples that you may have heard about before. So, they have these really bright colorations, and they serve as, warning signals to predators not to eat them, because if they had before, then they wouldn't be alive. So what about some pathogens that we're not really able to see? What about some of the bacteria and fungi that can find their way into a plant and really cause some damage? Well, we've talked about in the past quite extensively about the kind of grouping or the anatomy of cells here as well. We do have this thick waxy cuticle surrounding the leaf, and we've talked about in the past how that's really great for preventing water loss. But what about the diffusion of gases? And of course, stomatopores here and here were the workaround to that. But the problem is that, with these pores that are open, it also leaves the plant very susceptible for entry from bacteria or different fungal groups. Well, sometimes plants will also, in response to stress, not only just to water, but to some sort of infection, will close their stomatopores in response to this. Well, some fungi and bacteria have found a way around this as well. So they can get through this cuticle layer, this really thick, protective, waxy cuticle layer, by secreting lytic enzymes. And these enzymes digest all the mechanical barriers, essentially. So they can enter through the plant through openings like stomatopores. They can invade plants through wounding sites. They can be transferred by insect herbivores, which serve as vectors, and then these pathogens can invade that way. Fungi and bacteria are just really great at finding a way to infect plants. And some bacteria have found to be quite sneaky in the way they can find themselves inside the plant. So I mentioned that plants can close their stomatopores as a way to protect against infection. Well, there's a special group, the Pseudomonas group. It's a bacterial pathogen, and they're able to interfere with this closing and opening process here of the stomatopores. It's really quite specialized. So they release a molecule known as coronatine, and what this does, it reopens the stomatopores, and then the bacteria can just go ahead inside the plant that way. And it only takes a few hours to reverse that process, and basically they open up the stomatopores. So this is an incredible example of, I'm not sure what we can do about that for plants if bacteria have already started releasing lytic enzymes to digest the outer layer, and if they released a molecule that reopens stomatopores. Wow. So then we basically have a group of bacteria or pathogens that have swept through against that first line of defense. They've managed to break through the constitutive defense mechanism, and the plants don't really stand much of a chance in that way. Plants have evolved great defense mechanisms to protect themselves, especially with these amazingly toxic secondary metabolites and the great first line of defense in terms of mechanical barriers. But organisms have evolved counter mechanisms to defeat against these defenses. And this ends up being a great example of kind of a back and forth evolutionary process known as coevolution. So we end up with this really complex interaction between plants and other organisms in the system out there. And this topic itself, coevolution, is such a huge topic. And it doesn't need to be just between two species. We can have more than two species into the mix, leading to these evolutionary processes. But in general, a lot of these interactions guide the biotic interactions that we see with plants and other organisms. And these can change drastically, especially in the face of climate change. That's it for today's module. In Biotic Interactions Part 1, we started talking about the harmful interactions plants have with herbivores and pathogens. And we started talking about the defense mechanisms, in particular the constitutive defense strategies that plants use that are always present, such as mechanical barriers and secondary metabolites. And then we also talked about how bacteria and fungi have very special counter mechanisms to some of these barriers, and how some herbivores can use the secondary metabolites for their own defense. And finally, this can all lead to coevolution, where some species can affect each other's evolution, and a lot of these interactions play out in the environment today.